tend to pay less attention to the social. So we kind of take the social part for granted, maybe as if our networks were all kind of the same, or we just think of our own individual networks, or we think of the social in terms of a bunch of teenagers or something like that. But so we have a kind of assumption about social media, but we don't really think much about what the social actually means, or whether even something like society actually exists. For the last 30 or 40 years, many of us have been told repeatedly, in different ways and for different reasons, that there's no such thing as society, that society doesn't exist. And I want us to start out by thinking really briefly about three of these kinds of accounts. And so the first one, as you can tell from the slide from Thatcher, would be the neoliberal version. And that holds that there's no such thing as society, there's only individuals and families. In this version, even something like churches, which have previously been considered part of the social, are reduced to items of individual faith rather than to social forces. And in the United States, an institution like the Army is also not really considered social because we have an all-volunteer Army. So that, too, is like a product of individual choice. So in this Thatcher version, or this neoliberal version, what we have is basically an idea that society doesn't exist as a way of attacking the idea of the social, getting rid of stuff like, thinking about social solutions to social problems, getting away from the idea that that society has to deal collectively with its common concerns. Neoliberalism says no, this is an illusion. It's really just every man for himself, and people are first and foremost individuals. Now, there's another version, that's kind of second version, that I think of in terms of, I just call it the actor network version, or the object version, or the theme version, and I associate this with Bruno Latour, but the idea appears in a variety of guises in contemporary theory. And I actually think it's an idea that's underlying a lot of discussion in new media theory. And here, the beginning point is the same as in the neoliberal version, in that there's no such thing as society. But the difference is that's not considered necessarily a problem or necessarily a sign that there are only individuals or families. What it's assumed is like, well, there's no such thing as society, but we can fix that problem with the proper technologies. As long as folks have the right things, I need to get to my things. As long as folks have the right things, or as long as we attend to the ways that objects link to other objects, then we can put things together in assemblages and assemble social moments, social movements, and political issues. Now, these are always disruptible, but that, within this kind of actor network or object-oriented approach to the non-existence of society, so they're disruptible, but that's also a good thing, right? That means stuff's not set in stone. So here the idea is that society doesn't exist, but that's not a problem because we can always assemble a kind of society or reassemble it. Now, a third version, and we can call this the radical democratic or post-Marxist version, also asserts society doesn't exist, but holds that conflicts, forces, powers, struggle, competition, and oppression do exist. My own view is actually that these conflicts are society. So that would be where I disagree with this radical democratic view, but I'll talk more about that later. So the basic idea then is that, or the basic difference between the second and third version of the non-existence of society is that the second thinks in terms of things that help produce agency, that have a kind of creative action, and the third one is less attentive to things and more attentive to a variety of different kinds of dividing and unifying forces. These three different versions of the claim that society doesn't exist all share the historical setting of neoliberalism. That is, they all share a rejection of something like an organic social whole or something like a grounded totality. None think in terms of natural or inevitable hierarchies. None think in terms of a center of political power, and all would reject the idea that there's a central myth, theme, story, or authority that gives structure to society. Rather, they would all say that they're mutually productive entities, whether or not those are individuals and forces, and that these are contingent and the formations that they form are kind of open and changeable. Now, if there's something true or right about any of these accounts of society, and the society doesn't exist, what would we expect social media to look like? In the neoliberal version, we would expect social media to be individualistic, competitive, maybe focused on hooking up or making families or babies. People would look for ways to measure themselves and see who's most powerful, most successful. People would find ways to connect with potential reproductive partners. Or in a different vein, we might think with Boltanski and Schiappolo and expect people would want to deal with intense competition by building alliances and networks. So here we would expect individual competitors who might see it as in their self-interest to combine, and they would look for ways to do this easily and efficiently. They would also like to know what others are doing, right, so they can keep up with the competition or know what they're up against. At any rate, we would expect, if we have this neoliberal account of the non-existence of society, we would expect social media to be tailored to individualism, competition, alliance, and procreation. We would expect it to be concerned with individuals' interests, right, with their privacy and their security, much in the same way that companies and entrepreneurs are always trying to protect their own advantages. Now, what about in the active network or object version? Here, what we would expect social media to look like is lots of creative combinations and new opportunities, new things, new apps, new ways of connecting, lots of change and reconfiguration. There'd be maybe more delight in these things than in the kind of competitive individualistic view. The software might be more fun and playful, but in fact, there's actually not a whole lot of difference. We would expect a social media that's more fun, that's more for its own sake, maybe a little bit less profitable and goal-oriented, but we would still expect to have a kind of big dispersed media world. And then what about the radical democratic version? In the radical democratic version, we would see a lot of struggle and change. We would expect our social media to be perpetually fragmenting and deconstructing itself. We would expect that people would use social media to build identities, coalitions, and alliances, and that it would constitute a terrain of struggle, a shifting milieu. We would expect a kind of turbulence and contestation with respect to contents, uses, applications, platforms, protocols, etc. Now, generally, the three accounts of the non-existence of society would make us start to think that would give us a sense of the media environment pretty much like the one we have, right? So if we take the assumption society doesn't exist in any of these three ways, we would get the environment that we have. We might be surprised that a common protocol, TCP/IP, was possible at all, but for the most part, the internets that we have, our different devices, uses, and apps, are basically what we would expect to have given the non-existence of society. If society doesn't exist, we would expect social media to correspond in some ways to this non-existent, to be individual, competitive, fluid, contested, and turbulent. Right? I can make this point with a contrast. If we had a kind of communitarian overall understanding of the social, we might not even expect there to be social media because there wouldn't be a point to it, right? We would already be kind of cohesive, social, we would already be a kind of whole or totality. And it would be strange to think that there would be a social media that would be capable of doing anything. So, to have hierarchies, in-groups and out-groups, lots of opportunities for individualism and individual self-aggrandizement, we would expect that, and that's what we have. Now, let me make sure, before I go on, I want to make sure, I'm not saying that this is not a kind of simple reflection argument. Here's society, and it's reflected in the media. My argument so far is relying on a kind of assumption regarding mutual constitution, that the media, that this is the media we have, and that we that this is the media that we as separate, dispersed, unequal, competitive individuals would create and use. Yet what do we hear from critical media theorists and tactical media activists? We hear that the problem is centralization. We hear that what is needed is more individual control, more individual autonomy, more privacy, better security, more choices, and more options. And we hear this as if it were critical, as if this were a critical language, as if it were not simply repeating the dominant ideology of individualism. People talk as if egalitarian emancipation depends depended on independence from centralized structures of communication and power, as if centralization were the problem. It's like the mantra of concerns that animated John Perry Barlow and cyber libertarians back in the old days of the information frontier and the whole kind of California techno-utopian discourse. The guys that became the kind of wider champions of the new economy. It's like we keep hearing those arguments repeated over and over. The alternatives and their positive negative valences from back then and now are pretty much the same. Decentralized, distributed, bottom-up, contingent, and individual are better than centralized, unified, top-down, collective, and planned. And we should note, although I can't go into it here, that this ideological matrix became very powerful during the Cold War, and then was kind of groovied up in the 60s. Fred Turner has a great account of this in his book on Stuart Brand and cyberculture. Now, why do critical media theory people, and critical media people, keep repeating the critique of centralization, keep applauding and urging individual choice and self-organization, even as neoliberal capitalism has insisted on privatization, as well as on individual competition, rather than collective cooperation? I could give a psychoanalytic answer here, right? It's a kind of psychosis, right? It's a kind of paranoia and mistrust. Psychoanalysis gives us actually several different ways into this, whether or not we think it's a kind of psychotic approach to missing authority, or foreclosure of the paternal function that results in a paranoia that keeps subjects from acknowledging what's missing, or a kind of less kind of arcane psychoanalysis might just say it's mistrust. Right? These concerns with privacy and security are symptoms of an overall crisis of legitimation facing all institutions, a crisis that neoliberalism relies on and exacerbates. The weird thing, though, is that this expresses itself in critical media theory circles, or critical media circles, as a mistrust of networks, as if one needs impossible guarantees that we can never be secure enough, we can never have enough privacy, we can never be flexible enough. More specifically, it's like the critique assumes the possibility of some totally network where one could say whatever one wanted to whomever one wanted with absolutely no repercussions and still be political and radical. So I think that this paranoia argument is involved in a vicious cycle, right? What I call in broad theory a circuit of drawing, a perpetual paranoia that can never be secure enough. It's like, I don't know if y'all remember Mad Magazine and the old Spy versus Spy from the Cold War, right? So there's this kind of perpetual inscription of distrust. And Mark Andreevich talks about this really well in his, what's it called, his I Spy book, or I Media book, or something like that. Okay, so to reiterate, I'm just going to repeat the argument. My first claim is that there has been a significant critique of the idea of the social, and it's a critique that has pointed out ways that society cannot be said to exist, and that instead there are gaps and flows and forces and things and contingencies and processes. My second claim is that the social media we have look like what we would expect from this description of the social. They are changing and incomplete, multi-layered, populated by subjects and objects that compete and combine in various ways. And my third claim is that if the first two are true, then there is a problem with approaches to social media that critically invoke ideas that try constantly to reject and critique centralization, that constantly invoke privacy, autonomy, individual and choice and security. And the reason this is a problem is that centralization is not what's missing. Centralization is not what is pushing itself down on us in this era of distributed media. That's not the problem. Lack of individual choice is not the problem, and lack of loss of privacy is not even the problem. Rather, the opposite is the case. Dispersion is the problem. The multiplication of messages that make coalition and opposition ever more difficult. That's the problem. Decentralization is the problem, right? The creating of day workers and project workers and workers who work for no pay and then see if they win a prize for it. What was it? Der Spiegel had recently an article on